So welcome. This is 10 Rabbis You Should Know. This is our February Lunch and Learn. I'm going to ask everyone to go ahead and mute. I think there's a way for me to mute everybody. Okay, everybody's muted. So here are at least the beginning of the 10 rabbis that you should know. We're going to begin somewhat chronologically, starting with Hillel and Shamai. You might have heard of Hillel and Shamai. They're most famous for their arguments, for debating against one another and their many disagreements. If you know a little bit about Hillel and Shammai, then this is a pretty hilarious joke here. It says, not all of their arguments were settled maturely. You've got them playing rock, paper, scissors to see who's going to win the next argument in Beis Din rock, paper, scissors. And you can see Hillel is coming out way ahead here. That's very typical. In almost every single one of their arguments, almost every time that these two rabbis disagree with one another, Hillel ends up coming out on top with the authoritative ruling. What did some later rabbis say about them? Rabbi Nachmann of Bretzlov, who is not one of our, didn't quite make our top 10, and I'm sorry, neither did the Ari. Maybe we'll do the top 20. We can continue this as a series if you guys like. The name Moshe, Moses, stands for Machloket Shammai v'Hillel, the dispute between Shammai and Hillel, or the Machloket is the constructive debate between Shammai and Hillel. So all of Torah is built on this disagreement between these two great rabbis and the schools that followed them. Pirkei Avot, which is in the Mishnah, this is also after the lifetime of Hillel and Shammai, only by about 100 years or so. Every argument that is for heaven's sake is destined to endure. But if the argument is not for the sake of heaven's name, it is not destined to endure. What's an example of an argument in the name of heaven? The argument of Hillel and Shammai. So even though they disagreed, there was holiness in their disagreements. So what kind of ways did they disagree? Well, some of the most famous stories about their disagreements are found in the Talmud. This is a passage. The rabbis taught, it happened that a Gentile came before Shammai and asked, how many Torahs do you have? 2, a written Torah and an oral Torah. You've probably heard this before, right? The Gentile said, I trust you with regard to the written Torah. I believe in the writings, but I do not trust you with regard to the oral Torah. You may have heard this from non-Jewish friends in the past as well, who said, well, how can you have the Torah and the Talmud if they disagree with each other sometimes? The Talmud is an elaboration of the Torah. Or you say, we learn this, this is the tradition, this is what we do. You might have, especially a non-Jewish friend, say, but if it's not in the Torah, how do you know it's true? How do you know somebody didn't just make it up? So that's exactly the argument of this Gentile who says, convert me on the condition that you teach me only the written Torah. Well, Shammai admonished him angrily and kicked him out. Get out of here. Then he came before Hillel. Hillel converted him immediately. On the first day, he taught him, all right, if you're going to learn Torah, you got to start at the very beginning, a very good place to start. When you read, you begin with A, B, C, or in this case, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Daled. I see some of you singing along with that. Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Daled. So he's teaching him the letters. Here's Aleph, here's a Bet, here's a Gimel, here's a Daled. The next day, he reversed the order. Same page, he said, okay, here's a Daled, here's a Gimel, here's a Bet, here's an Aleph. And the guy said, wait a minute. Yesterday you told me the exact opposite. Hillel said to him, so don't you have to rely on me as a teacher? Then rely on me regarding the oral law as well. That's right, even the very basic fundamentals of understanding a sacred text. We have to rely on teachers, even understanding the letters that are written in the Torah, even the very basics of how to read the Torah. So, if you need a teacher to understand even the most basic concepts of the Torah, like what the letters are, then surely you should rely on a teacher for understanding the deeper meanings, and that's why we have the oral Torah, the Mishnah, the Talmud, the Midrash, etc., etc. So that's pretty good, right? Got a new Jewish convert, and he made his point. A few of you watching this are teachers. In fact, maybe even the majority, as I'm looking at who's here, at least watching this live, are teachers. And so you can probably relate to some of these teaching techniques. There's probably a technical name for the way that he teaches things. That's very inclusive, that gives his students the credit they deserve, while also teaching them why it's important to learn things a certain way. Well, it happened again. Similar situation, another Gentile goes to Shammai and says, convert me on the condition that you teach me the whole Torah while I stand on one foot. Now, this translation says, while I stand on one foot. The Talmud is actually a little bit vague. So you may have learned this as I did. Teach me the entire Torah while you stand on one foot, making the teacher look a little bit ridiculous. So maybe Shammai's response is a little bit more understandable. He pushed him away with a yardstick in his hand. So he grabbed a long stick and chased him out. Get out of here, okay? The first guy he just told to leave, this one really upset him, chased him off with a big stick. Same guy came before Hillel. He converted him. So this is what Hillel does. Right away, right off the bat, congratulations, you're Jewish. If only it were that easy, right? He said, that which is hateful to you, do not do to your friend. This is the, presumably, he stood on one foot. You can't see my feet right now. That which is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow. This is the entire Torah. The rest is commentary. Now go learn it. Sometimes we leave off those last two words there. Can't leave those off. That's the whole crux of the statement. Everything else is commentary. Now go learn it. You need that commentary. Both of these tales come from Shabbat 31a in the Talmud. Another passage of Talmud teaches about the nature of this machloket, the nature of these disagreements. It's going to get into a little bit of technical language, but at the end you're going to see, even if you don't follow all of the technical language, you're going to understand the significance of what's being said here. Come in here. This is a common phrase in the Talmud. Although Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel are in disagreement over the questions of rivals, sisters, an old bill of divorce, a doubtfully married woman, a woman whom her husband had divorced and stayed with him in the night in an inn, money, valuables, a pruta, and the value of a pruta. Anybody here gotten married recently or had children who got married in a Jewish ceremony recently? A pruta is the standard monetary value in a ketubah. All of this is talking about issues relating to marriage. So they disagreed on all of these issues relating to what makes a legal marriage. Beit Shammai did not, nevertheless, abstain from marrying women of the families of Beit Hillel, nor did Beit Hillel refrain from marrying those of Beit Shammai. This is to teach that they showed love and friendship toward one another, thus putting into practice the scriptural text, love ye truth and peace. So even though they disagreed on all of these very important technicalities, even though they disagreed on the status that would make someone eligible for marriage, they still agreed, for the sake of the community, for the sake of being one Israel, of not creating a divide, we will accept the marriages and divorces of the other party. We should be this wise and this giving in Judaism today. So that's a little bit about Hillel and Shammai. Rabbi Akiva, coming a little bit later. Now we're talking Hillel and Shammai. It's like 1st century BCE. Rabbi Akiva, now we're talking 2nd century of the Common Era. Rabbi Akiva is one of my personal favorites, so I'm glad that we're going chronologically. We get him near the top of the list. Rabbi Akiva. What do we know about Rabbi Akiva? Most of what we know about his life is recorded in the Talmud. The Gemara relates, Rabbi Akiva was the shepherd of Ben Kalva Savua, one of the wealthy residents of Jerusalem. The daughter of Ben Kalva saw that he was humble and refined. She said to him, "If I betroth myself to you, will you go to the study hall and learn Torah?" He said to her, "Yes." She became betrothed to him privately. I would translate that secretly, and sent him off to study. Her father heard this and became angry. He removed her from his house, and took a vow prohibiting her from benefiting from his property. I mean, this Rabbi Akiva his lifetime is one of the great love stories. I don't know why this hasn't been made into a Hollywood movie. He's a simple, humble shepherd. He's working for this wealthy socialite family. Meets the daughter, they fall in love. Star-crossed lovers. Her father finds out that they got secretly engaged. He disowns her, says, "Get out of my house. You're cut off financially. You get nothing for marrying this poor, worthless shepherd boy. You should be marrying some wealthy, great scholar or some wealthy citizen." Kicks them out of the house. What do? Up until the age of 40, Rabbi Akiva had not yet studied a thing. One time, while standing by the mouth of a well in Lida, he inquired, "Who hollowed out this stone?" So he's looking, he's seeing a big well or a spring. I've seen it, I learned it translated as a spring. And he's watching a big hole in this rock. He said, "Who carved out this stone?" They told him, "Akiva, haven't you read that water wears away stone?" They quoted some Tanakh at him. They said, "Rabbi, or he wasn't a rabbi at this point, just a shepherd." They said, "Akiva, you're 40 years old and you don't even know this simple verse from Job?" It was water falling upon it constantly, day after day. At that, Rabbi Akiva asked himself, "Is my head harder than this stone?" You've ever heard of somebody being hard-headed? He said, "Okay, I may not be the smartest guy around. I may be a little bit dense, a little bit, I might have rocks in my head, but surely my head isn't harder than this rock." He went, "Is my mind harder than this stone? I will go study at least one section of Torah." He went directly to the schoolhouse, and he and his son began reading from a child's tablet. This is not an iPad. This is a piece of stone or parchment or slate where you could draw and erase. Okay. So they're learning from the tablet. Although I like to picture an iPad. You can if you want. Rabbi Akiva took hold of one end of the tablet while his son the other end. The teacher wrote down the Aleph Bet for him and he learned them. Aleph to Tav, he learned them. Then the book of Leviticus. He learned it. Then he went on and studied and learned the whole Torah. So this is one I love to imagine. Rabbi Akiva, who we're told even at the age of 40 had a long white beard, sitting in the kindergarten with his son, learning letter by letter, learning all of the lessons of the kindergarten. And then he graduates from kindergarten in a couple of weeks. They move him on to the first grade. And pretty soon, he's studying at an advanced level just by sticking with it, just like that drop of water wearing a hole all the way through the stone, drop by drop by drop. He learned all of this Torah drop by drop by drop later in life. So by the way, if your kids are 40 years old and you're thinking, "Oi, my kids, they're lost, they're working, menial jobs, they're not married, they don't have kids. What are they doing with their lives at the age of 40? They have hardly accomplished anything." Don't worry. There's still hope for them. Even Rabbi Akiva only began to study at the age of 40. I do see there's a hand up. Let's hold the questions for the very end. Okay. Rabbi Akiva went and sat for 12 years in the study hall. This is what happened next. This is from another passage of the Talmud. When he came back to his house, he brought with him 12,000 students. As he approached, he heard an old man saying to his wife, "For how long will you lead the life of a widow, of a living man, living alone while your husband's in another place?" These are about sacrifices they made for family. Everything that's written here, I'll be reading if you can't read it on the Zoom. Also, I'm hoping that the recording will be a little bit more clear. For those of you who are watching on YouTube, you should be able to read it clearly. She said to him, "Listen, if my husband came, he should go study for another 12 years. Rabbi Akiva overheard this, and he said, "I have permission to do this." He went back and sat for another 12 years in the study hall. When he came, he brought 24,000 students with him. So he became so revered and influential as a teacher that students flocked to him by the thousands, even though he had to leave his wife, leave his family in Jerusalem, go all the way to Babylonia, which is where the major academies were at that time, to study with the top rabbis in the world. Even though he couldn't come back for 24 years, he finally returned as the great rabbi, one of the greatest rabbis, not only of his generation, but one of the greatest rabbis of all time. That's why he's in the top 10. He comes back to Jerusalem, and sadly, things don't work out too well for him. He ends up becoming a part of this new movement, this new rebellion. Rome has been increasingly stifling and oppressing the Jewish people. But the Jewish people still yearn for independence. And so in Jerusalem, he meets this fellow, Bar Kokhba. Bar Kokhba is a title, it's a pseudonym. We don't actually know what his real name was. Bar Kokhba means son of the stars or sun child, if you want to translate it into 1960s. So Bar Kokhba comes along. He's this spiritual force, this charismatic force. He is a military genius, and he says we can rise up, we can lead this rebellion against Rome, and we can reestablish the monarchy of King David and the Maccabees right here in Jerusalem, and we can rule ourselves. That's the dream of Bar Kokhba. Rabbi Akiva buys in. He says, yes, here you have the greatest scholar, the greatest teacher, the most respected spiritual leader in all of Israel, putting his full weight and reputation behind Bar Kokhba. The rebellion rises, organized as an army of hundreds of thousands of Jews to attempt to rise up against Roman domination. But they are sadly defeated. Bar Kokhba is killed, and all of his followers, including Rabbi Akiva, is tragically martyred. You see here on the screen, or maybe you see on the screen, I don't know if it's still a little bit blurry. That just has to do with the internet connection. We can't do anything about that. But these are coins that archaeologists have uncovered from the Bar Kokhba rebellion. And you see on the front side is an image of the temple, and on the back side is an image of a lulav, probably. These were the symbols of Jewish independence, that we want to be able to reinstate all of these Jewish practices that the Romans have been abolishing. Unfortunately, they failed. The rebellion was crushed. Rabbi Akiva was martyred. I won't go into the details of his martyrdom, which you may have heard on Yom Kippur or even on Pesach, when we read the passages of Talmud that describe how horribly he was martyred by the Romans. They were not known for killing people gently. But let's jump forward a little bit. Now we're in a new period of Israel. We've got Yehuda Hanasi. Yehuda Hanasi, also known as Judah the Prince. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi was the editor of the Mishnah. So at this time, all of these different parts of the Mishnah, the earliest Jewish rabbinic text, were oral teachings. They were taught from teacher to student, passed on through the generations. All of these teachings of Hillel and Shamai, they were not written down at that time. All of the teachings about these different disagreements, all of these stories that we have from the Mishnah, from the Talmud, they were not written down. They were only memorized and recited orally. Now, there are some great books out there where you can learn to memorize huge numbers or lists of facts. There are people that can recite pi to 1,000 digits. There are people that can memorize an entire deck of cards. And the amazing thing is, they say that these are skills that anyone can learn. This day and age, we don't have much use for those skills. We don't really celebrate people who can remember lots and lots of passages verbatim. It used to be, even just 100 years ago, if somebody could recite long passages of poetry, could recite Shakespeare plays from memory, that was somebody who was admired, that was somebody who had potential for, advancement in school and academia and life. These days, there's not as much emphasis on memorization, and so it's a skill that's not taught. And over the past 2,000 years, it's a skill that's mostly been lost. But we know that 2,000 years ago, people had and honed these skills so that they could memorize entire passages. So you could memorize the entire Torah. And believe me, all of these rabbis that we mentioned here probably had the entire Torah memorized from start to finish. I've only met 2 people in my life who have the entire Torah memorized, both now of blessed memory. One of them was a professor who taught other rabbis, one of my professors. So you can see, if you're the one who gets chosen to teach rabbis Bible, you might be a real expert, a really rare expert. He spent one summer just before, a few years before his death. He had a break that summer and said, I've got the entire Torah memorized, but I don't know all the trope. And so that summer he memorized the entire trope, and he could chant any passage from Torah from memory. What did you do with your summer, right? The other fellow that I knew, also a great rabbi, neither one quite made it onto this rabbi, but Rabbi Zalman Schachter, or Rabbi Reb Zalman, was the founder of the Jewish renewal movement. So you've got, Reform, Orthodox, Reconstructionist, renewal. If you're a rabbi and you found an entire stream of Judaism, you might be a pretty incredible scholar, and indeed he was. You could open up. I talked to folks who read Torah in the synagogue where he attended, and they said it was always nerve-wracking if he got called up for an aliyah. because he would be right next to you in your ear. You're studying for, all week to chant these verses, and he's standing right behind you chanting along with you just from his own memory. So it is possible to memorize the entire Torah, and it is possible to memorize the entire Mishnah, which is all of these teachings of these different rabbis from these early days. Unfortunately, these were all scattered around not just Jerusalem, but the world. In Jerusalem and Babylonia, they were taught differently in different not different versions, but different mishnayot, different teachings for different schools and different teachers. There was no organizational system. You were just taught in whatever order the teacher happened to remember and bring them to you. That's how you were taught. And so Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, or Yehuda Hanasi, Judah the Prince, he was the one who took all of these different teachings from all of these different schools, compiled them and said, okay, we got to put these into some kind of order so we can keep track of them. We've got to write them down so they don't get lost completely. And he was the one who organized and edited all of the Mishnayot. He didn't put every single Mishnah in there. In fact, he also made a separate collection called the Tosefta, which was finalized after his death, which is a bunch of other teachings that could have been in the Mishnah, but for whatever reason, they didn't quite make it. So you've got Yehuda Hanasi, came from a great rabbinic family, the son of Shimon ben Gamliel II. There was an interesting story about his birth. When he was born, the Romans had already forbidden, because of that whole Bar Kokhba thing, and because of the whole, actually, he also lived around the time of Bar Kokhba, similar timing. Because of all of those problems with the Jews, according to Rome, they had banned a lot of Jewish practices, including Brit Milah. So he was secretly circumcised, but his mother was on good terms with the Roman governor's wife. And so after the circumcision, they swapped the babies. And when the Roman authorities came to investigate and to verify that this Jewish child was not circumcised, instead they found the other baby, and they said, okay, it's good. It's intact, however the Romans declared it. And so they gave him a pass. And so he was able, through this relationship with the Roman governor, because they had this, because his mother had this relationship with the wife of the Roman governor, he was able to be circumcised and go on to practice Judaism. By the way, that other baby went on to become Marcus Aurelius, who is considered in Jewish texts to be an enlightened and compassionate ruler who was sympathetic to the Jews and understood the relationship between the Jews and the authority, and was able to rule with compassion. All of this was to great benefit of the Jewish people, who, although we did not achieve true full independence, in the life of Yehuda Hanasi, he was able to establish a near independence for the Jewish people. Nasi is a title that really only applies to one person, and that's Yehuda Hanasi, Judah the Prince. He was not only the most authoritative teacher of Torah, obviously being respected enough that he was permitted to compile the entire Mishnah, all of the Jewish teachings of all of the different schools, into one compendium, into one work. Not only that, but he was respected by the Romans as a ruler. And so when they needed anything from the Jewish community, the Romans would go to Yehuda Hanasi. He was that intermediary that was enabled to maintain the peace and prosperity of the Jewish people under Roman rule. It was said of him, from the days of Moshe Rabbeinu, that's Moses, until Rabbeinu HaKodesh, meaning Yehuda Hanasi, there was never found great Torah knowledge, combined with great wealth. So here it is, you've got Moses, who, of course, was very wealthy as a prince of Egypt. And then 1,000 years later, more than 1,000 years later, you've got Yehuda Hanasi, who is also wealthy and a great scholar. And they say, other than these two examples, no one else has ever been wealthy and powerful and influential and also been a great Torah scholar. It is related, this is from the Talmud, that on the day Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi died, the sages decreed a fast and begged for divine mercy so he would not die. As they said, anyone who says Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi has died will be stabbed with a sword. There's some deep denial that's happening here. The sages, they hold Yehuda Hanasi so dear, they say he can't die, he's not allowed to die, nobody's allowed to even say that he's dying. Well, his maidservant went up to the roof and said, what am I going to do? The upper realms are requesting the presence of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, and the lower realms are also requesting the presence of Yehuda Hanasi. You understand what she's talking about here? May it be the will of God that the lower world should impose their will on the upper world. Let it be so that this good man gets to live because of the prayers of human beings. May they override the judgment of heaven. That's what she's saying. However, when she saw how many times he would enter the bathroom and remove his phylacteries in great pain, shuffling to the bathroom, taking time to remove his phylacteries, his tefillin, and then using the bathroom, also probably with some stress, anxiety, and pain, and then put them back on, and how he was suffering with his intestinal disease, she said, may it be the will of God that the upper world should impose their will on the lower world. In other words, let God have mercy on him, and let this poor man end his suffering and go to heaven. Even though we still need him in this world, it would be a mercy. The sages, meanwhile, would not be silent, i.e., they would not refrain from begging for mercy so that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi would not die. The power of their prayer was so intense that it stayed the hand of heaven. So she took a jug and threw it from the roof onto the ground. It crashed open. All of the rabbis stopped praying and looked over to see what this great commotion was. And due to the sudden noise, the sages were momentarily silent, refrained from begging for mercy, and Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi died. We're jumping forward about 1,000 years here to Rashi. So he lived in the 11th and 12th century. Rashi is actually an acronym. You've probably heard of Rashi if you know a little bit about Judaism. If you're here in this class, you've probably heard of Rashi at least once. It's an acronym for Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki. Rashi. You get it. So he lived just about 1,000 years ago. He was one of the most influential, in fact, I would go so far as to say the most influential commentator in Jewish history. He wrote the complete commentary on the Torah. If you open up any Torah with commentary, the very first one on the page is going to be Rashi. If you don't see Rashi there, take that Tanakh, give it away to someone else, because that's something sketchy. I don't know. Rashi is going to be number one on the page. He is the classic Torah commentator, the authoritative commentator that all other Torah commentators are responding to. Not only that, that would be a tremendous life's accomplishment. Not only that, but Rashi also wrote an entire commentary to the Talmud. All right. Now the Tanakh is only about that big. Here's the complete Tanakh, right? Actually, this is the complete Tanakh. So that's the Torah and the prophets and the writings. It's not a very it's that big. That's the whole thing. The Talmud, however, is this entire top shelf over here, and I don't even own the whole thing yet. I could take this to the library, and you would see one, 2.5 shelves of our library down the hallway filled with just one volume or one edition, I should say. All those volumes of one edition of the Talmud. So he went through, and every single one of those editions, if you open it up, the first thing you see on the page underneath the text of the Talmud is Rashi's commentary. He is, again, the commentator that all other commentators, just like he did for the Bible, he is the one that all other commentators are responding to. If you open up a printed Talmud and you see commentary there and it doesn't start with Rashi, take that, give it away, get rid of it. There's something suspect there. Rashi is the number one commentator of not only the Torah and the Talmud, and he was a tremendous leader in his own age. He went away at 17 and started studying at yeshiva to become a rabbi. The yeshiva where he studied in Worms was later renamed the Rashi Chapel, or at least it was built on that site years after his death. Although that was also destroyed in World War II, unfortunately, by the Nazis. Now, at that time, rabbis were not paid, and so he also worked in a vineyard. And presumably his wine was very good, and he was successful as a vintner, I think is the word. Anybody know? I'm getting a nod. Someone who makes wine. Um, and that's what he did to earn a living. He owned a vineyard, he made the wine, and in his free time is what he did all of this, 1,000-year legacy that we still read and study today. In his day, he also witnessed the terrible massacres of the Crusades. You know what happened in the Crusades? The leaders of the church said, we've got to go to the Holy Land. We've got to get all of these heretics out of the Holy Land. They were talking about Islam. They were talking about Muslims, the Ottomans and the Arabs. I don't recall. Somebody who's a history buff can help me out. I don't recall who was in charge at that time, but it was a Muslim control over the land of Israel. Well, they said, we've got to get an army together. We got to send them down there. We got to get rid of them so we can retake the Holy Land in the name of Jesus. And that's what they did. Unfortunately, they were not very good at Saladin. Yes. Was Saladin Ottoman? I want to say. I'm seeing a nod. Maybe. But yes, that's exactly who we're talking about. So unfortunately, they were not very organized. And when they started to get these armies together, they just basically sent out a call across the land, and people started going town by town by town and saying, okay, we're the army, we're the militia, grab your pitchfork, grab your scythe, whatever weapons you have on hand, grab a torch, and we're going to start marching from Central Europe all the way to Jerusalem. Believe it or not, most of them didn't make it that far. But along the way, they encountered these Jewish towns where they said, wait a minute, we're traveling halfway around the world to go fight heretics in the Holy Land, but we've got heretics right here at home. And so as they were marching across the Holy Roman Empire, which was Germany and Italy and most of Central Europe, and they came across Jewish towns, they wreaked havoc, they burned down towns, they killed countless people, and Rashi was one of the witnesses to this. That was the world in which he lived. There's a story that's told about Rashi. He went to yeshiva and sat down to listen to the lecture of the dean. And there was a very difficult passage in the Talmud that the rabbi struggled to explain to his students. Well, when Rashi was left alone, he took a slip with his commentary, tucked it into the book, and put the Gemara, put it into the book of the head of the academy. Well, the following morning, the rabbi opened up his Gemara, found this little slip of parchment with this passage of Talmud and a clear, simple, straightforward explanation of this very difficult passage, and he was amazed. He told his students, "Who put this here? This is incredible. This is great." I mean, have you ever seen what's the movie with Matt Damon? How about them apples, right? I can't believe it's a great film. I'm blanking on the name of it right now. Hopefully someone will hopefully you know what I'm talking about. The janitor who's writing on the chalkboard at MIT and solving all these equations no one else can solve. That's Rashi. That's who we're talking about. And just like in that film, the professor stands up and says to his students, who put this here? Who solved this really difficult problem so elegantly? And none of the students stood up. Well, Rashi was listening to this, and all of the students were going on, "Oh, it's so amazing. It explains it so clearly. It's so accurate. It's so, it makes it so easy to understand. It solves all the problems with this difficult passage," but he still doesn't own up to it, because he's presumably very humble. And instead, he ends up throughout his youth going to different academies, and he does the same thing, presumably at his own school and other places where he's studying and visiting and teaching, and just putting in his little pieces of commentary sort of everywhere he goes, until finally he was discovered planting one of his notes, and he was exposed, and people said, "Oh my gosh, all of these notes we thought were God's word. They were coming from heaven because they were so insightful." Rashi was the one who was doing it the whole time. I would be remiss if I brought up Rashi and didn't mention his daughters. Rashi had 3 daughters and no sons, but he was a tremendous scholar, and so he made sure that his daughters were tremendous scholars as well, and they were respected in their own right. This one, I'm sure you probably can't read it all, but I'll read exactly what it says on here instead of paraphrasing. This is a quote from Maggie Anton, who, by the way, is very funny if you haven't heard her speak, and she's the author of Rashi's Daughters, which is a series of historical fiction books about Rashi's daughters. So she writes, "As part of my extensive research behind my Rashi's Daughters, no subject intrigued me more than the elusive and ubiquitous legend that they wore tefillin." This is very significant. Rashi's Daughters, it said, wore tefillin, which, at least in modern times, has been reserved only for men. Well, until the 20th century, till the late 20th century, when women started wearing tefillin as well in some Jewish communities. "Indeed," she writes, "when I first started studying Talmud and was introduced to Rashi, I was told the legend where that legend held that they were learned and they wore tefillin. I actually tracked the earliest mention back to the 18th century, but there was no evidence provided. To this day, there is no hard proof that Rashi's daughters wore tefillin. However, there is evidence," and she cites some sources, Machzor Vitri, Avraham Grossman, Elisheva Baumgarten, and others, that a few women did wear tefillin in the 11th and 12th century Ashkenaz. That's where Rashi was. That means Europe. Just as some women wore tzitzit, blew the shofar, performed circumcision, and had aliyah to the Torah in Rashi's community. Thus, one might argue that if any woman was going to wear tefillin in that time, surely it would have been Rashi's daughters. As far as I'm concerned, The answer to the question, did Rashi's daughters wear tefillin, is maybe. You'll have to look at the evidence that she presents here and decide for yourself if you think it's true. And we're going to split this in half. I know I promised 10 rabbis that you must know. We're going to do just 5 today. We're going to stop. I promised at least one female rabbi. So we're jumping all the way to the 20th century with Rabbi Regina Jonas. Rabbi Regina Jonas was the very first woman who was ordained as a rabbi. We have no other record, no earlier record of a woman being ordained before Regina Jonas. And in fact, the knowledge of that was lost for about 50 years when Sally Priesand was first ordained as the first American woman rabbi. It was believed that she was the first female rabbi in history, that all other rabbis had been male. The reason is amazing and tragic, why we didn't hear of Regina Jonas until more recently as we began to investigate. So she writes, if I confess what motivated me, a woman, to become a rabbi, 2 things come to mind: my belief in God's calling and my love of human beings. She's writing this all in German. God planted in our hearts skills and a vocation without asking about gender. Therefore, it is the duty of men and women alike to work and create according to the skills given by God. It's pretty good reasoning, isn't it? Well, she was born in Berlin in 1902. At the time, that was the center of the Jewish world. That was the center of Jewish scholarship. I don't care if you're Orthodox or Reform. At the time, those were your 2 options. This is where all of the interesting stuff was happening. She grew up in a poor, mostly Jewish neighborhood. Her father, a merchant who died of tuberculosis in 1913 when she was just a kid, probably was her first teacher. Early on, Regina Jonas felt her rabbinic vocation. Her passion for Jewish history and Bible and Hebrew was apparent even in high school, where fellow pupils recall talking to her about becoming a rabbi. Edward Bennett, professor of Talmud at the Hochschule institution and responsible for rabbinic ordination, was the supervisor of her final thesis, which dealt with the topic, appropriately enough, may a woman hold rabbinic office? That's a pretty good thesis if you're going to be the very first female rabbi, right? Now here's what's interesting. A copy of the document has been preserved and can be found at Centrum Judaicum in Berlin. Submitted in June 1930, the paper is the first known attempt to find a halachic basis for the ordination of women. Jonas combined a halachic line of argument with a modern attitude. She did not follow the Reform movement, which was willing to achieve modernization by abandoning halakha. At that time, that was the basis of the Reform movement. Get rid of the old, all of the superstitions and all of the outdated laws, get rid of them. That was the attitude of early Reform Judaism. When we're talking, almost 100 years ago in Germany. Rather, she wanted to deduce gender equality from Jewish legal sources. The female rabbinate should be understood as a continuity of tradition. In other words, she's writing in an orthodox framework to try to understand or try to, I don't want to say justify, but to try to explain why in Orthodox halakha, women are permitted to be rabbis. And that's her thesis. This proves her independence of Jonas from both orthodoxy, which held equality as incompatible with halakha, as well as Reform, which saw itself as the sole advocate for female emancipatory interests. In 1941, when most of those who had escaped, she worked after she was ordained for many years as a teacher. But in 1941, most of the Jewish community had escaped deportation due to or had to do forced labor, were therefore unable to attend regular services. The congregation instituted special services. Jonah, who was herself forced to work in a factory, led many of these services. Survivors report that her sermons and her pastoral work were especially uplifting and encouraging. On November 6, 1942, Regina Jonas and her mother were deported to Theresienstadt. Even there, she worked as a rabbi, preaching and counseling. She was officially part of the Referet Fur, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, which was led by the famous psychoanalyst Viktor Frankl. On October 12, 1944, she and her mother were deported to Auschwitz and probably killed that same day. We understand to some degree the expansive impact that the Shoah, the Holocaust, has had on Jewish population, on Jewish psychology, on our culture. But we often forget how far it set back Jewish civilization. It was not only the lives that were lost, 6 million Jewish lives that were taken during the course of the Holocaust. It's also all of the scholarship, all of the writing, all of the innovation that was set back. And if you want proof of that, just look at Regina Jonas, who was ordained by a mainstream Jewish institution in 1930. And it took another 40 years before Judaism caught up to where it was in the 1930s for another woman to be ordained by a major institution. It set us back 1 or 2 generations in our understanding, in our scholarship, in our humanity before we finally got caught up. And we know that Jewish population still has not reached the numbers that it was before the Holocaust, depending on how you count, that we are still making up that difference. All right. That's where I'll stop. Sorry, it's not a cheerier note, but these are 10 incredible rabbis. Hopefully soon we'll have an opportunity to come back and look at these, at more of these rabbis in the future as we take a look at some of the most influential, most interesting, most important rabbinic figures of all of Jewish history. You'll have to stick around for the next class to see if your favorite rabbi shows up. And who knows, maybe I'll start taking requests. I'm not sure when we'll be able to come back to this. Probably it will be for next month's Lunch and Learn, or maybe we can do a special session looking even deeper, maybe even more than 10 rabbis. But now we're all out of time. Thank you for those of you who are here joining me on Zoom. I know a couple people had to leave early because it is your lunchtime. All of these classes are available on YouTube. They're usually uploaded a day or two. I say 24 to 48 hours. It's not a guarantee, it's an estimation. But usually you can go onto YouTube. You can send your friends to our YouTube page to watch these videos. If you're watching this on YouTube right now, you can always, subscribe to the channel and make sure that you get all of the future videos. You can bookmark this page, whatever it is that you need to do to make sure that you don't miss the next one too. Have a great day. Have a great rest of your lunch, those of you that are still enjoying. And I'm going to stick around after I stop the recording to answer any questions that you might have.